Hi, this is Barbara Ham-Lee. In commemoration of Black History Month, the Another View Roundtable takes a look back at African American history and compares it to today in areas like education, politics, literature and the arts, and even international diplomacy. Where are we as a people? How much progress have African Americans made? Have we overcome racism? Or are we no better off today than yesterday? Roger Chesley, Carol Pretlow, Bill Thomas, and Tim Seibles join us with their take on being Black in the past and the present. Plus, we continue our series Excelling in Spite of Jim Crow. Deep conversation next on Another View, so please stay tuned. Nearly mouth.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. So yesterday, slavery, the poll tax, raising consciousness through poetry and the arts, civil rights marches. Today, human trafficking, voter ID laws, rap and hip-hop, Black Lives Matter. See any similarities? Is history repeating itself when it comes to the Black community? Are things better, or have we been lulled into thinking so since some of us have so-called made it? Stimulating conversation with our roundtable. Roger Chesley is a columnist with the Virginian-Pilot, and you can read his columns every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Hey, Roger.
Hello, Barbara. Are you enjoying this lovely day outside?
I am enjoying this day. It is
That's
beautiful.
very
You know,
good.
the weather keeps changing. My nose keeps getting stopped up. It's just
Well, I
a
hope you're
wonderful
all
thing.
clear today.
Absolutely. Carol Pretlow is a political science professor with Norfolk State University. Hey, Carol.
Hey, Barbara.
How are you?
Wonderful.
Glad you're here.
Glad
Bill
to be
Thomas is our resident community activist. Hey, Bill.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's a
Good
good
to
day.
see you.
Great
Good
day.
to
Great
see
day
you.
for America.
Absolutely. And joining us by phone is Old Dominion University English professor and poet laureate Tim Seibles, who is in Philadelphia taking care of some business, but I think he's still partying from the Super Bowl.
He might be.
He might be.
Is that what's happening with you, Tim? You still partying from the Super Bowl?
I wish I was here. I wish I was here for the party. I was driving up just in time to get stuck in the traffic as people were leaving the parade. But no, I didn't get to get
they
to
had
the
a
party.
parade.
Just I've been trying to look after my parents and see what's what.
Oh, gosh. Well, congratulations to you. I assume you're an Eagles fan, but maybe I should make that assumption.
Absolutely.
Okay, so today, Roundtable, we decided we'd do something a little bit different since it's Black History Month. I asked each of you to give me a topic that you wanted to kind of look at yesterday and today and see how it comes together. So let's start with the first one. So 1869, the 15th Amendment passed giving African-American men the right to vote. Women could vote as of 1920. Jim Crow laws in the South enacted grandfather clauses to keep blacks from voting, poll taxes, literacy tests. And it wasn't until 1965, with the passing of the Voting Rights Act, that legally barred barriers to voting based on race. And today, Roger, what are you thinking?
Yeah, you know, it is amazing how far we've gone past, because this is the state that in the 1901-02 state constitution had so many provisions to keep black folks from the voting booth. As one delegate said, then discrimination, why that is precisely what we propose.
Wow.
When you look at where we are today, some of the efforts to prevent certain people at voting precincts, they aren't nearly as blatant or nefarious as in years past. Nobody is preventing people of color from queuing up, and you don't have to pay money to cast a ballot. But what we do face today is usually more subtle, couched in diversionary language, and meant to keep the politicians in power exactly where they are. It's become clear blacks, Latinos, and folks promoting fairness will have to continue to fight to ensure hurdles don't crop up. And we also can't afford to sit out on Election Day. One of our biggest problems is apathy. And in a state like Virginia, which votes every year, that's a dangerous illness to have. Among the battlegrounds that we do face, voter ID. Many states, usually with GOP-controlled legislatures, have added requirements that voters show a form of ID, usually with a photo. And as I've written many times, on its face, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But the true intent, however, has been to make it harder for people who usually support Democrats to cast their votes. And this includes blacks, Latinos, the poor, the very young, and the very old. They're the ones who mainly lack such ID. Education about the requirements is key, so is the need for citizens to demand enough forms are accepted. For example, in some states, hunting licenses are okay, but college IDs aren't.
Wow.
Early voting. Most states now have in-person absentee voting or early voting. Some, like Virginia, still force you to have at least one approved reason to vote absentee in person. Every year when this comes up in the legislature, it usually doesn't get very far. I mean, you can usually vote early without too many problems, but you have to have an approved reason. And if you don't have the reason, then you're left with having to lie on the forms. Polling places that are too large. Virginia had many places during the presidential elections in 2008 and 2012 where waiting times lasted as long as 4 hours. This included some precincts in Chesapeake and Virginia Beach. Local registrars and city councils must do a better job of having enough polling places and workers. Typically, these problems occur more often in large cities and suburbs and less frequently in rural areas or sparse communities. And lastly, among this, districts that simply don't hew to the will of the people. In recent years, courts on the state and federal level have repeatedly struck down legislative and congressional districts for racial reasons or illegal gerrymandering. This week, for example, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court released its opinion about why it rejected the state's GOP-drawn congressional districts. It was, quote, aimed at achieving unfair partisan gain. This skews what happens in Congress and increases partisanship and increases probably the likelihood that you're not going to get compromises in Congress. For example, in 2012, Democrats won 51% of the statewide popular U.S. House vote, but only 5 out of 18 House seats. I believe this was in Pennsylvania. Federal courts in Texas, North Carolina, and Wisconsin have found that either politics or intentional discrimination played an unacceptable role in drawing electoral lines. And this is important because blacks are so closely linked to Democrats, especially in presidential elections. Yet Republicans are determined to keep power even when they don't win most of the votes. GOP-led legislatures had the upper hand following the 2010 census and controlled redistricting in many places, so much so that in 2012, Democratic candidates won over 1 million more votes than Republicans, but Republicans controlled the chamber by a 33-seat margin. So these are some of the issues. Racism, maybe not the biggest issue here, but power is still a very big part of this. And if we want candidates and proposals that are in our best interest, we have to be involved. And we have to continue to vote, to agitate. And so the game might have changed, or the field might have changed a little bit, but some of the same challenges are still there.
They're still there. So Carol, why do you think it's still so difficult? Because back in the beginning, when we were trying to get the right to vote, there was this desire and this fight to be able to vote. How do we get past the apathy?
Do you know, I was talking to some of my students about it, and I think it's to just insist both in the academic arena and in the social arena to insist that students get involved. And I know this is controversial because we'll say, well, it's their independent right not to be involved, but that's a part of the learning process about politics and about social work and about all of the areas that we're in. And I think when we engage students and give them specific duties related to the electoral process, then they come through.
Okay, Roger.
And there's some people say, well, I'm not going to vote because it's not going to make a difference.
Well, we saw that right here in the state.
We saw that right here in Newport News in the legislative district between Yancey and I'm blanking on the opponent who lost. But, I mean, a few more people just showing up and casting votes would have made a difference in that particular contest, which went basically down to a coin flip, picking a film canister out of a bowl. But the other thing is there are some people who say it doesn't make a difference. it might not make as much a difference as you want, but you have to be involved in everything that could, and voting still matters. It's one of the parts of our citizenship, and it's still important to dictate what political leaders do, what elected leaders do.
Bill, I know that you've, in the past, when we've had these discussions about voting and so forth, the whole voter ID law thing you thought was silly, that people should just go out and get an ID.
Am I
misquoting
it's not
you?
silly. It's the law. Whatever we have to do, whatever policy dictate that you have to do to go vote, you need to do that and go vote. It's not silly. It's just what you have to do.
Meaning, when I said silly, I meant that you have said in the past that people who are opposed to that, to going out and getting that ID or are able to go get it, you would say they need to just go get an ID. That's what you would say.
I agree with that. There.
Okay.
If you don't do that, I won't say the words, but there's some words for it. If you don't go vote, thanks, Roger, for the lesson, and that was really, really comprehensive and good for that. It really was. But in President Obama's first election, the black registration and black voter turnout was 64%, much higher than the white voter turnout. In the election in 2016, it was 62%, again, much higher than white voter turnout. So we're voting when we want to vote. But
you said we need to vote all the time.
We need to vote all the time, even when Barack Obama's not running, or if I decide to run for president of the United States, you need to go vote.
Lord, I'm leaving.
But the whole issue with Shelley and David Yancey.
Thank you.
Okay, Shelley. Yes, thank you.
What happened was it made that determination that every vote counts, and it really, really counts, and we just need to go vote. I've been on this earth for a few years. I've been voting since I was 18, and I have voted every election since then. Every one. And there were hurdles, there were obstacles, but we can get around it. And the last election that we had in Newport News, in that particular race, the voting in that district alone was up, I think, anywhere between 9 and 12%. I can't remember the number, but it was 9 or 12%. There were 12,000 more votes than it was the last turnout.
So people get involved when they want to get involved. Tim, what do you hear from your students? I want to bring Tim into the conversation, or from others in terms of why someone may or may not vote.
Well, it's very hard to say. I've heard, as Roger and Bill have mentioned, the old it doesn't really matter, my vote isn't that important, well, it doesn't matter who wins the election because the Republicans and Democrats aren't that different. I've heard both of those. And, of course, I think it's ridiculous. We can tell, even though certainly the distance between the parties in terms of how they see the economy may not seem wildly different, but it is different. And certainly in terms of social policy and the way they imagine American society, I think the differences are pretty market. I think there is clear that, generally speaking, Republicans have a much more of a conservative idea. I will not say racist. I won't go that far, but a much more conservative idea about how this culture might operate. Certainly, I would think some of their attitudes, including the impulse toward gerrymandering to rig elections, does kind of smack of days long past. Which, in fact, were, of course, in many ways defined by a racist impulse to keep people of color, specifically black folks, from voting. So I do think it makes a huge difference when we vote. But I continue to hear things like, doesn't matter that much, and blah blah blah, and and sometimes people I just think they're bewildered by the political process. They just don't understand how the politics at the national level, and sometimes even at the state level, they don't really have a clear sense of how those things affect them, like as individuals. So they kind of, I don't know, they just let things kind of slide. It just doesn't have that kind of grip in their lives, which of course is a mistake because everything does end up resolving itself at the individual level, really.
Yeah. Absolutely, because all politics are local at the end of the day. Roger, you want to have the last word on your topic, and we'll move on to the next one.
I just remember in the early 1980s, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I couldn't vote for a voting congressperson or senators, and my first full-time job was in New Jersey. And I made for darn sure that I was going to be there for a very close U.S. Senate race that took place that year. I think it was 1982. And it's just so important and to know the people who looked like us died or got beaten, or people who were fighting for us to have this right. I don't take it lightly at all, and I'm hoping that people understand the history lesson, especially some of our young people, about what it took for us to have a real voice.
Let me ask you a question, because you bring up a really good point too. Now, you lived in the district that did not have the right to vote for Congress or for the Senate.
Right, and even now have a non-voting delegate.
Exactly.
In the House.
So from that perspective, did that make you even more determined to vote?
Oh, heck yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because sometimes people take for granted that it's just, something we can do.
Right.
But
this was going to be something, I was in my young 20s then. This was going to be a chance to really help decide who the U.S. Senator was in New Jersey. And I had never had that opportunity before. Yes, I had the chance to vote for president, but not for that. And so, and even now, that's still a whole issue, whether D.C. is ever going to get statehood. But yeah, it was something I took very personally, very seriously.
Bill.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to correct, I mentioned David and Shelley. I actually should have said Delegate David Yancey and Miss Shelley Edmonds.
Yes.
They're both friends.
Simons.
After that, yeah,
Simons.
Got her name wrong anyhow.
That's
Shelley
okay.
Simons.
But anyhow, that shows you the power of one vote, the power of doing what you need to do, and the turnout in the African American communities all across Hampton Roads was really strong the last local election for state representation.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic. Harlem, New York City, the home of the Harlem Renaissance. From 1910 until about the mid-1930s, it was the golden age in African American culture, manifesting in literature, music, stage performance, and art. Tim, what was the goal, and where do we stand today in terms of how far we've come?
Well, part of the battle that black folks have been fighting, and which is connected, of course, to things like voter rights and so on, part of the battle that we've been fighting, of course, is an accurate representation, or I should say establishing an accurate representation of who we are as people. And so the Harlem Renaissance, especially in terms of literature, the literature of the period, the Harlem Renaissance was the time during which many black folks, and not only in New York, sometimes people think the only writing that was done by black people during the Harlem Renaissance was in New York, but there were a number of authors who lived in various places who also contributed to the literature of the period. But that was a period during which black folks were determined, and of course they had different ideologies informing some of their work, but they were determined to tell the story, both in historical terms and in terms of the present, of who we are. Because, of course, so much of the information floating around during the period tried to define black people and black lives in terms of stereotypes. Black people are lazy. They're not really that smart. Well, there really isn't any literary impulse in the black community, and so on and so forth. And also just certain ideas that were clearly intended to degrade the community. And so the Harlem Renaissance, which of course ultimately gives rise to the Black Arts Movement of the 60s, which ultimately feeds the era we're in now, which is, I would dare say, also a golden age of African American literature. That's another story. I won't go into that right now.
Okay.
But in part, the Harlem Renaissance was this kind of remarkable synthesis of all kinds of thinking. I mean, you had militants operating during the Harlem Renaissance, and you also had people who were very interested in trying to just simply establish respect for the community so that we could be embraced and celebrated as, our white counterparts or whomever else was in the culture. We simply wanted to say, hey, we also, have, a heart. We also have intellectual interests. We also, have, deal with all the existential, questions that any other people on Earth deal with. Just essentially, the Harlem Renaissance, I think, really let us put our feet solidly down in America as a viable cultural force. Now, if we think about it in terms of today, you have people like Terrence Hayes, who not too long ago won the MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as the Genius Grant. You have Toni Morrison, of course, who may be maybe the greatest novelist of the last 20 to 30 years. I mean, I think it can be debated, but she's certainly in the discussion, one of the great literary minds of the last 3 decades or 4 decades even, and that's all minds. I'm not talking about black minds. I'm talking about all minds. You know, so you have that. You have Tracy K. Smith, who won the Pulitzer not too long ago in poetry. You have Tamba Jess, who also just won the Pulitzer in poetry for his book. So you have, I think, and I could go on and on about names.
And we have Tim Seibles, too.
I've had some good fortune as well. But
it's not fortune. It's not luck if it's good. Come on now.
Thank you. I'm trying hard. I try hard to do what I do. But the idea is that I think in the Harlem Renaissance, that's where the tree of black culture in America really put down its most significant cultural roots. This is not to say that those that weren't also political aspects in this. All this stuff, I think, connects. I mean, what we were talking about in terms of voting rights and so on, all that stuff is connected. It's all connected. If you read W.E.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, comes out in 1904, I mean, he's talking about everything, you know, education, what that would mean to black people, what the lack of it, I should say the forced lack of it has meant to black people, also issues of voting, also issues of culture. He was someone who thought, of course we must establish ourselves as a viable cultural force so that other people will in fact say, oh, okay, their humanity is equal to ours. Now, I think he knew, and most of us who are thinking people know, that bigots don't give up their bigotry easily. But so who we're really speaking to in terms of the cultural interests of various artists, writers, musicians, so on, you're speaking to the people who are hovering in that area that they just don't know anything about people. You just don't know anything. And so the Harlem Renaissance certainly spoke to a large number of whites who weren't necessarily hardened in their prejudice for black people. They were simply ignorant.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's the critical thing, and so that begins the ongoing cultural movement by African Americans in this country, which includes, you know, hip hop and all kinds of cultural phenomenon that are rooted in black aesthetics and so on.
So today, like you were saying about hip hop, for example, some people think that is noise. They don't understand it. They don't, but yet we see it infused throughout the culture. So is this a new form of Renaissance, if you will, or a new form of expression that is going on in the black community today? That would be a growth out of the Harlem Renaissance?
Well, I certainly think hip-hop, like most of what we think of as black culture, has some connection to the Harlem Renaissance. But hip-hop doesn't spring out of nowhere. Hip-hop's, you know, roots probably go, I mean, we think about the last poets in the 60s who were also speaking rhythmically with musical accompaniment, except often explicitly politically, but also there were some also playful things during the 60s that were really spoken word things. And you also think about the blues. I think hip hop's roots really are, I mean, it's a little less obvious, but I think hip hop has roots in the blues too. So I'm not sure hip hop just comes out of nowhere. I don't think anything does, to be honest.
Tim, let me ask you a question.
I think hip hop, you know, hip hop is a viable force in the culture as well, depending on, you know, who's listening. Who's
listening? Yeah. Let me ask you a question though, because my impression, and maybe my impression is incorrect, when people though talk about the Harlem Renaissance, they really look to the black intelligentsia in terms of all of this. But yet we know that culturally we have people who bring to the table, you know, thought and culture and so forth from all walks of life. And so am I off on that in terms of there was for some reason that the Renaissance was thought of as more of the intelligentsia as opposed to, the guy who was down working the tobacco field, who also had a perspective on life.
I think I think what people imagine, I think partly rightly so, is that the Harlem Renaissance was driven by the black intelligentsia. It was driven by people like Du Bois and Alain Locke, and of course ultimately Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and Angela Grimke and Georgia Douglas Johnson. I mean, these were all powerful intellects, highly educated people who had a particular vision of how the presence of black folks could become a viable presence given the circumstances of this country. I think the guy who's the plumber down the street, the person who's working in the bar, they were probably aware of these things, like the energies that were being generated by the black intelligentsia. But probably in terms of visible contributions, in terms of books, in terms of music, in terms of paintings, that was probably largely rooted in the efforts of black folks who had the educational opportunities to learn certain things that would allow them to be novelists and poets and playwrights and so on. I mean, you can't really have, because people often forget that the number of black folks who were college educated during the Harlem Renaissance was not huge. I mean, it was not a tiny number, but you were among a relatively select few if you were someone with a college degree. And remember, Du Bois was a Harvard graduate. You could probably count the black Harvard graduates on one hand when he had his degree. And so certainly I think the movement was driven by the thinking and the intellectually edgy citizens in the black community. But surely the plumber and so on, the guy working fields, surely they both were beneficiaries of it and probably contributed in ways that they may or may not have been aware of, simply by living the lives that many times black writers were trying to portray in their work.
Gotcha.
So they were the living source of much of the inspiration. Of the
If you're just joining us, we're talking with the Another View Roundtable about Black history yesterday and today with Roger Chesley, with the Virginian-Pilot, NSU political science professor Carol Pretlow, community activist Bill Thomas, and poet laureate Tim Seibles. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next topic. To make sure everybody has enough time. So here are some names that may not be familiar to you. Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett was the first African-American diplomat appointed Minister Resident Consul General of Haiti in 1869. Clifton Wharton was the first African-American to join the Foreign Service. He was also the first African-American appointed as chief of a diplomatic mission to a European country. He was appointed in 1958 to Romania and in 1961 to Norway. Edward R. Dudley was the first African-American to hold the rank of ambassador, appointed ambassador of Liberia in 1949, and Patricia Roberts Harris was the first African-American woman to hold the rank of ambassador, appointed to Luxembourg in 1965. Carol, who's in foreign service today, and is that an area where African Americans are still engaged?
We are still engaged, and I don't have specific names, but I am very proud that I have students who are doing internships in the Department of State and the Defense Department. And as one of my students called me the other night, and I was thinking about this, I thought back to the 1950s and Ralph Bunche. And he was such an influence on my life, because when it was announced that he was going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, my teacher stopped everything to talk about him and how phenomenal it was that here we had, and at that time we would call Negroes, a Negro who was going to be involved in diplomacy. And from that moment on, I was fascinated by him. And she said, but it's not enough to be fascinated. You have to understand the progress that he made and the whole situation between Israel and the Palestinians and how remarkable this was. And so as I looked at his career, not only in terms of his foreign service career, but his career as an academic, I said, wow, this is phenomenal. Now, there was one quote that I shared with my students this morning, because I have students that are taking constitutional law, and they were like, well, what's the connection here? But I pulled this quote to share with you. He said, I'm a Negro. I'm also an American. This is my country. I own a share in it. I have a vested interest in it. My ancestors helped create it, to build it, to make it strong, great, and rich. All of this belongs to me as much as belongs to any American with a white skin. What is mine, I intend to have and to hold, to fight if necessary, to uphold it. I will not give up my legacy in this society willingly. I will not run away from it by pursuing an escapist fantasy, the illusion of a black heaven, not gone, but I'm going to fight here and now. And it ran. Wow. And so, of course, as I think about the number, because he was also an educator, the number of educators and political scientists and all of those involved in the international community, I look at his career, because not only did he negotiate or begin the process of negotiating the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian territories, but he insisted that this country look at Africa and the countries in Africa. I don't think we've gotten there with regard to Africa.
I was getting ready to say, where do you think we are in terms of today? And how do we get people, more of our young people in particular, interested in this as a career?
Well, we know how the president feels about some of the countries in Africa.
We do. Yes,
well,
unfortunately,
I'm glad
we
you
do.
mentioned that, Roger, because that came up in a class this morning. And I said, well, here it is I started to say with all due respect to our president, but the reality is the ball's in our court. Let's show him by our engagement, by our voting, by our participation, by understanding what the State Department does, what Homeland Security does. Let us understand all of those connections and get involved. And fortunately, we have students now at Hampton and Norfolk State and all who are offered internships with the Department of State, and also that's where we go.
Were any of you, Roundtable, you too, Tim, surprised at the number of African Americans who are actually is doing diplomacy for this country outside of this country?
No, absolutely not.
No, not
absolutely
at all.
not. Actually, we have a very robust State Department program for young African American children and others as well, to expose them to that. I've had that all along, and it's part of our history as we look across the ocean to Africa, where we came from, to study it, to understand it. And again, it's looking at how do you do international policy, how does it influence and impact our lives, and regardless how difficult it may be the transition for us to get to the positions that we should get to, we have great strengths in it. And we have just a very good certified program that every year goes up to the State Department, have an ambassador or somebody address the students, and it works very well. And there's plenty of black folks up there doing good work.
And just a plug for Norfolk State, we have an ambassador coming in March.
Go ahead, Tim. What did you say?
No, I said I was pleasantly surprised. I just so often. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So often you hear of opportunities, but you don't know whether those things actually come to fruition. So the fact that those opportunities have been made good on, I think, is the great surprise and pleasant surprise for me, that there's so many black folks working in diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. I was surprised that it went back as far as the 1800s, which to me was just awesome, that was happening. So, and who's coming to Norfolk State?
I've gone a brain freeze here, and I can't remember. I was just so excited that an ambassador was coming, but it's in March, and the ambassador will be engaging, not just giving a speech, but engaging through classrooms and visiting to see what students are interested in and how they may be brought into the international community and express an interest in it.
There are so many people who think sometimes that we are, that we don't engage in the world, that we're only about whatever is going on right in our immediate circle, and that we're not worldly. And I just think that's such a misconception.
Well, I think that's obviously, ridiculous to think that even now, with the way the internet has brought people so much closer, the ability to get on a plane here and go anywhere around the world, and just how interconnected that we are. We at one time, I think, as a country, thought about walling ourselves off from the rest of humanity, and we can't do that.
Yeah.
Different wars have proven that we can't do that. The attacks on our own soil on 9/11 proved that we can't do that. So we need to stay engaged and to understand and have some sense of what is going on. And I think the internet has, good and bad, this is a good way because we understand, I think, better what's going on in other countries.
Okay, last comment, Carol, then we got to go to Bill.
I think on the university campuses, both Hampton and Norfolk State, we now have opportunities for students to go as students at semester at sea or semester of abroad programs that they can see firsthand. Then they come back and they see the connections to everything else they're learning.
Okay. Mr. Bill, you told me your topic was dreamers.
Yes.
Now, I came up with a couple of things, but I want to hear from you.
It's simple. You said you wanted to reflect back to where we were and where we are today.
Absolutely.
And excuse me, audience, I have a terrible sore throat because I got dehydrated while running a mini marathon. So not drinking enough water.
How did you do?
I finished. But I did finish. But my throat is terrible. Oh, thank you. And but the real, the DECA thing stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Uh-huh.
And when I first heard that, I'm just saying, we've been talking about it, and Roger, I think, quite distinctly addressed this issue as well. What about deferred action for African arrivals? We've never, with voting, with getting our rights, with this horrible types of institutionalized racism that put us in this box we're in that still is very much influenced today. And you look and see how our black immigrants are portrayed in the media and in our politics. It's really, really difficult for me. I care everything about every human being in this earth, and I think everybody should be given a chance to have success. And these unfortunate children that are now tied up by coming here illegal, and now they have very stringent issues against them, which I totally think should be done differently. Because most are working, most are decent people trying to do the best they can. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that applies over what we are. We have children that in some cities, including Baltimore and others, and Chicago and others, that are sitting in freezing classrooms. Mm-hmm. We have classrooms here in Norfolk and Hampton and Richmond and in our cities here in the zip code that are not getting the types of things that they need. Why can't we give these kids, our kids, and then they will, and the president is awfully wrong about referring back to us as whatever, because that's just the way the tradition has been. And there was not a very strong, robust response to that, I think, from the Democrats. It should have been not in just talking about it, but start to build the policies that are going to make people strong. Or when we're trying to get people in your leadership at the Norfolk Regional Housing Authority, and other communities as well, when we're trying to transition, why don't we do the right thing and put the right kind of transition in so we can build legacies of hope? The way I look at this foundation is more Booker T. Washington driven than W.E. Du Bois and others, because again, I think it reflects back on us. And I've not heard yet a strong politician at the federal, local, or state level come up with policies that are going to take care of our deferred action for us. We're not asking for handouts. We worked all our lives. If you go back and look at how the first Commonwealth in Virginia, where the first people ever came here, and we're still fighting these battles, a lot of us don't even know that when we first came here, we were indentured slaves. Yes. We weren't all tied up and chained down at the bottom of the boat. We were sitting up on the top of the boat with the white folks that were chained with us. And we worked harder. And we even outpaced them and outdid them. So that's my tragedy, not to defer from someone else, but to refer back from us. Our HBCUs are not being funded. The money's being cut. Our programs are being denied. All of the entry programs that we used to have are now being cut back, where kids that really need the help can't get it. And right now, you just have a collective number of folks that have real opportunities to learn, because you don't learn in the classroom from grade kindergarten to grade 3. It's very difficult to defeat those odds. African American or white. It's just very difficult. So my point is, looking back and looking at what deferred action on things and then looking at these dreams, the dreams was the whole theme of our whole upbringing. It was Martin Luther King's dreams. It was the preachers in our community's dreams that made us and connected us to vote, to own our own businesses, to be respectful, and to understand that we couldn't look for anybody else outside of our communities and the service that we worship to be for us. So that's why I am somewhat detached and somewhat disappointed that we put so much effort into this group. And that's okay, that's fine. But we're first. Let's look at us. Not for handouts, not for the Virginia. There's a crazy law down at General Assembly where if you win the lottery, they're going to go back and take your benefits away from you. And for that to even stand, for that discussion to even come up, when everybody knows that that is wrong, everybody, Democrats, and there's no marching, there's no new laws that are being in fact. They're saying, basically, black folks, if you win the lottery, we're going to take your money. And that is the connotation. Now, white folks play the lottery as well, but the connotation of what it is for us. And for us not to stand up and then support one group against our very own, to me, is very disappointing. And
so let me ask you guys roundtable all the way around, because Bill, you bring up a lot of good points also. But do you think that from the past, when it clearly was racism, and the determination specifically to keep black people in one place, has that moved to today more poor people as opposed to? So has it moved to economics as opposed to race?
Oh, I think so.
Roger.
And in some ways it's coded because unfortunately we're disproportionately poor. We're disproportionately in prison. We have some of the social and medical ills probably in manners, but you can say it in such a way that it might not sound racist, but it is racist. It is racist. So
the poor becomes the new black,
absolutely,
if you will.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes, and I even see this divide sometimes among black people ourselves, where sometimes I think we say, well, those are poor blacks. We don't necessarily have to, we sometimes separate ourselves. And it's a good way to divide and conquer sometimes.
Yeah. Tim, go ahead.
Oh no, I was really disagreeing with Roger. I just think that economics has always been the game. I think earlier in the conversation, someone talked about the real interest is power. Well, money is power, and so to the extent that people, are disenfranchised and are less capable of have less opportunity to begin their own businesses or to sustain certain businesses or to get loans from banks and so on. To that same extent, they are less likely to be able to be successful in the financial sense. And of course, financial success means you can send your kids to different colleges, you can give your kids different kinds of opportunities for education and so on. So it bleeds into every aspect of the society. So yeah, absolutely. The game is definitely dollars. And I think in probably 50 years, will we really be talking about poor people and people who have haves and have-nots. The color thing will become less important than the idea of, who's got what.
Okay, Tim, go ahead. Bill, I see you shaking your head.
I just disagree with my colleague. The color thing is the color thing, and it's a long way from changing. It's just so disappointing. I remember when I first went to school, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and I played with my white friends all during the summer. We played baseball, we swam, we did everything, and this is in the late 50s, my first year in school. And then when it came to go to school, we couldn't go to the same school they went to. I mean, I never trusted government again to see my mom cry. My father is on station fighting for us and helping us, or at least in the reserves doing it at that time. And that was just the most disappointing thing. And we were solely denied that because we're African American. And I still think that same thing lives today with us, because if we even support it, it's really funny. And I can't think of the gentleman at the business page on the Virginia-Pilot did excellent stories on the wealth in Hampton Roads of African Americans and the banks we used to have. We used to have a financial intermediation in Hampton Roads that had more savings and loans, more banks per capita than any city in the country, Atlanta included. We had the banks, we had the SNLs, we had small savings and loans all across the Commonwealth, especially in Norfolk and I'll think of his name, I'll find out. But he used to write on that very well because we did have that. We had our own hospital. We had our own institutions where we took care of ourselves. We had strong papers. We had strong churches. And we had a lot of things going on. Some of us escaped that and then kind of turned our way around and went to do other things. But at the same time, the basic call for discrimination or differences among us to keep this illegal, intolerable, hateful, just racism going on, and it was institutionalized, and it's still today. We are looked at differently because of the color of our skin. And I know there's been some progress, but at the end of the day, if you're sitting up on the top of Norfolk Southern Building at a board meeting, and Roger and I was walking down the streets, we wouldn't be, those are two people. No, those are two black people. Mm-hmm. And what are they doing in Norfolk? And I'm not trying to generalize that, but I'm just saying that is still how it's looked. Hampton and Norfolk State, ice isn't as cold as UVA or ODU.
Well,
we got
whatever you talk about. I'm going to leave it.
No. I'm just saying we only got a minute and a half left. And I want to ask one little question for each of you. Then we have a story we need to go to. So for each of you, from A to F, from your perspective, are we making progress or not? Tim.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
so you give us an A.
If I think about the just in the literary community alone, the number of awards and the kind of notice that is being given to a number of writers of color, of many colors, but certainly black writers, is so different than even 25 years ago that I do think there's a step forward.
Okay, great. That's Tim Seibles, Poet Laureate. Thanks, Tim. We appreciate you very much. 30 seconds. Go ahead, Bill. A or F? A to F.
A C.
A C.
But there's so much potential we could do better.
Okay, Carol?
I'd say a B+ because I had an experience at the NARO the other night that was phenomenal. I was just sitting in the back thinking, just me, and the number of people who came because of this show and because of contributions to the black community.
Fantastic.
I was amazed.
Roger?
I'm with Bill. I'd say a C. I think you would think we would be, as a people, so much farther along. Right. You would think the hurdles would be fewer. You would think that our achievements better. C.
C. All right. Roundtable, we'll come back and we'll do it again next month. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Claude McKnight of the group Take 6, and you're listening to Another View.
Jim Crow was a way of life for African Americans living in the South. From 1880 to 1965, Jim Crow laws kept blacks in their place and separated them from Southern whites. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 forced America to legally stop its blatant discrimination against black people, but the changes could not erase the memories etched in the minds of those impacted by the practices. In part 2 of Excelling in Spite of Jim Crow, Alma Anderson, Judith Crawford, and Morris Ross, all members of First Baptist Church Berkeley, share a few examples of how discrimination because of Jim Crow impacted their lives.
I was 11, 12, and I had an uncle who was president of the NAACP for a long time, and he had crosses burned in his yard, and I was scared to death. I mean, here's a cross, the KKK is burning a cross in my uncle's yard that we play in, that really close to the house, because the yard was not a big yard. So really scared.
It was in 1959, going into a movie. The movie was called The Match Game, and I went with my cousin May Sue, and I was just used to going into the movies. We didn't have balconies in Cleveland that I remember, and so I went with her, and we paid our tickets, and I was about to go in, and she said, no, we have to go to the balcony. And I couldn't believe that. I said, why do we have to go to the balcony? She says, that's where all the colored people sit. And I said, well, you almost white looking, But she said it doesn't make any difference. And it impacted me so much that I never went back again until 1970.
When you went to a doctor, and there were very few black doctors, and you were ushered into the corridor, and we sat on a hard bench, and there was always a room across from that where the white patients sat with big comfortable sofas and magazines and everything for them to read, but we sat directly from the door in this little corridor and had to sit there, and we had to wait generally until all of the white patients were served.
Back during that time when you had white and colored water fountains, white and colored bathrooms, it kind of worked on your psyche. And I can remember what it was like having to go to the water fountain, and you would have this nice water fountain here and then this dilapidated water fountain, and then you knew that they wanted you to drink from this, and it was bad. I knew it wasn't right, but it was a matter of causing trouble or accepting things the way they were at the time. I attended school in New Hanover County in Wilmington, and I have to give a lot of credit to an English teacher there at Williston, which is where I graduated, Miss L.S. Williams. She had a way of making you feel good about yourself, and she helped not only me, but lots of students. She helped us have this sense of self-worth, self-esteem, a sense of being worthy. And she helped us tremendously.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
So when you listen to those stories from Jim Crow, for me, it just shows the resiliency of our people and how no matter what, Bill, I see you shaking your head.
No,
you had a lot of those experiences.
I totally agree. And the reason why I gave our progress a C, because we still lead America in the least educated people, highest disparities, most dying of cancer. Portsmouth leads the Commonwealth. City of Hampton has the highest incidence of cancer. I mean, everything that we have, we're still there. It's not broken. The path has narrowed some, but it's the same. It's consistent. And so we got to fix all of that.
We got to keep moving forward.
Those were good words. I really love that.
And you can find the podcast of our series, Excelling in Spite of Jim Crow, at whro.org/radio. And you can always visit anotherviewradio.org to download the podcast of any Another View program. And while you're there, please sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. Next week, the Another View history lesson with the Hampton Institute students who refused to sit in the balcony in what is now called the American Theater in Phoebus. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sinnott. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Alexis Smith answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.